In this video, I'll be showing you how to sand your board and shape the rails. If the top and bottom of your board is still pretty rough and maybe there's still some glue squeeze out showing in between your strips, start with a heavier grit like 60 or 80 grit on an orbital sander. Remember, the internal frame provides the shape of your board, so you shouldn't really need to remove too much material from the top and bottom. Try to keep your sander flat so you don't accidentally create uneven bumps that will be hard to smooth out later. After this rough sanding is done, you might notice or be concerned about some small gaps you're seeing between some of the strips where the pieces maybe weren't clamped perfectly tight. Don't worry, you can fill these gaps before your final round of sanding by mixing a couple ounces of your epoxy resin in a small cup and then adding some fine sawdust to create a nice paste similar to the consistency of peanut butter. Use this thickened epoxy paste to fill those small gaps, pressing it in with a squeegee. Just scrape off the excess so you don't have to sand off too much hardened epoxy later. Let that epoxy harden and then switch your sanding disc to 120 grit paper. Repeat the process of taking long, flat strokes over the entire surface of your board. After you finish with the 120, I like to do what's called a grain popping step, which is a common technique amongst furniture makers. Simply take a spray bottle and mist the entire surface of your board and then wait for the water to dry. You'll notice this raises small surface fibers of the wood grain and almost creates a fuzzy texture. You can sand these fibers smooth with another round of 120, or you can switch over to a 150 grit if you've got it. So once again, the progression is 80 grit to remove glue and any superficial dings, fill small gaps with sawdust epoxy paste, 120 grit, mist with water to raise the grain, then another 120 or 150 to the final smoothness. Next, we'll talk about shaping and sanding your rails. This can be an intimidating process for some because there's a little bit more freedom to shape the rails how you want, unlike the top and bottom shape, which is more or less given to you with the frame kit structure. Keep in mind that paddleboards are generally more leisurely and recreational compared to performance-focused boards like surfing, so the rail profile does not have to be rocket science. Your goal should just be to create a rail that's symmetrical, that looks nice, and feels good in your hands. To accomplish this, I used a sanding block with some 80 grit to knock down the sharp edges of the rails to create a rounded radius around the board. I then used the natural curvature of the top deck to create a softer or more rounded edge on the top, and then I left the bottom edge a little harder or more angular. Since I used only one layer of planks for my side rails, there's really not a lot of material here to shape. If you're using more layers, this is going to be a little bit more of an involved process. A good portion of my rails will remain flat, and since this is a touring board made for straight line speed more than agile turning ability, I am okay with that. Try to replicate your rail shape on both sides of your board to create symmetry. The best way to do this is just to run your bare hands down the sides of the board and make adjustments based on what you're seeing and feeling. Continue all the way around the board, and don't forget to blend in your rail profile into the nose and tail blocks. Once your rails are roughly shaped the way you want them, switch it back to that 120 grit paper and give them another hand sanding. Just like the top and bottom, you can add a grain pop step and finish with 120 grit or 150 grit to create a nice smooth finished surface. And that's it, you have the final shape of your board complete and it's almost ready for fiberglassing.